Hello, everyone. Welcome to Factual Foundations of Policy, a podcast from the Tenenbaum Program for Fact-Based Policy at the Hoover Institution. I'm your host, Tom Church, and today I'm joined by two healthcare policy experts as we attempt to figure out what happened with the expiration of some of the Affordable Care Act subsidies, why it led to a government shutdown, and why each side has a different approach to healthcare reform. My first guest is my Hoover Institution colleague, Lanhee Chen. Lanhee is the David and Diane Steffi Fellow in American Public Policy at Hoover. He's also the Director of Domestic Policy Studies and a lecturer at Stanford University. He's advised several presidents, several candidates for presidents, and has written extensively on healthcare policy. And my other guest, I'm very happy to have us joining, is Nancy Ann DeParle. She's the managing partner and co-founder of Consonance Capital Partners. She was the former administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services under President Clinton and was a former deputy chief of staff and longtime advisor on the Affordable Care Act for President Obama. Lanhee and Nancy Ann, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tom.
So we're here today to talk about healthcare, namely the recent push to extend the E.P.T.Cs, the Enhanced Premium Tax Credits, in the Affordable Care Act. Lanhee, I'll start with you. Will you walk us through the E.P.T.Cs, what they were, who was receiving them, and why they led to a shutdown last year?
Well, I think to answer that question, Tom, we've got to think about the structure of the Affordable Care Act more broadly, and just briefly. The concept was really to try and figure out how to get more Americans health care coverage, and there were a variety of different mechanisms to do that. Some of that was in the expansion of the Medicaid program, which is the joint state and federal program that covers many lower income Americans. And then there was this effort to really expand private insurance take up by Americans who weren't eligible for that coverage. And so, through a variety of discussions and debates around the original Affordable Care Act, there was a structure created to essentially incentivize the purchase of private health insurance through the health insurance marketplaces that were created by the Affordable Care Act. Many of those marketplaces are administered by states. For example, in California, where I live, we have a program called Covered California. And the idea was to make that coverage more affordable. That was the genesis of the original tax credits, premium tax credits and subsidies that were in the Affordable Care Act. And then during the COVID pandemic and in the aftermath of that, there was an effort to expand affordability of plans for more Americans further. And so some of the income restrictions that were originally put in place in the Affordable Care Act, which capped the availability of those subsidies up to about, I think, was 400% of federal poverty level. Some of those restrictions were lifted so that they would be more generous for a broader swath of the population. Again, all with the goal of expanding coverage. So the debate that we recently had was really about whether those temporary extensions, the ones that originally originated during COVID, whether those extensions would continue for some period of time. And that was really the genesis of the disagreement, I think, between Republicans and Democrats. I'm sure Nancy Ann will correct my factual inaccuracies and maybe some of the way that was characterized, but that is kind of the most sanitized description, I guess, I can give of what we just went through.
Sure. Nancy Ann, can I have you jump in? January 1st happens this year. These enhanced premium tax credits have expired. What happened? What happened to the people who were receiving them? What happened to the Affordable Care Act market?
Well, so far, what we know, I think it's early days, but what we know is uh, from the reporting from the states that run their own marketplaces and from the federal marketplace that around 1.3 million people who had been signed up did not sign up again. So, uh, you know, they're not going to participate this year, presumably because the cost increased. I've seen various estimates of the cost increase. It matters a lot where you fall in the uh, degree to which you're around the federal poverty level, 400% of the federal poverty level, which is around $62,600, I think, for an individual. If you're right around that, you could be facing doubling of your premiums. If you're further away from that, it might be less. On average, though, this affects everyone. It's a marketplace. So once the actuaries started working on the premiums for this year in covered California and in the various other state exchanges, and uh, they each looked at their actuarial analysis. And if you want to talk about facts, here's where it's really interesting, because actuaries use judgment as well as facts, and it all bundles together into what they're saying is an average 26% increase for the 24 million people who were in that part of the marketplace. If I could just circle back, you saw me nodding aggressively or energetically, I hope, while Lanhee was talking, because I thought it was a very fair description of the enhanced advanced premium tax credits. I would just add, this is supposed to be about fact, but there is a realpolitik part of fact as well. So when we were working on the law, as Lanhee said, there were both carrots, which the premium tax credits were a carrot to help people participate in the individual market who, we had 50 million uninsured. So we wanted as many of them to get insured as possible. Why? Not just because we think it's a good thing for society, although I do, but also because it affects everybody. If they're not insured and they show up at the hospital, then that causes uncompensated care, which increases the premiums for everyone. So whether we like it or not, we're a community, and what we do affects each other. So there was something called an individual mandate, which was a requirement that every person show evidence of insurance on your tax returns. I just got my thing in the mails, that I get to submit with my tax returns. And then there were carrots like the advanced premium tax credits, which, as Lanhee says, were capped. Why were they capped? We looked at hundreds of regression analyses showing what would happen to different sort of synthetic families that were created. A family of three who ran a dry cleaning business in Vienna, Virginia. I mean, literally, we came up with families and had the guys up at MIT run these different analyses. And there's no question that having more generous tax credits, more generous subsidies would have helped get more people in. We were trying to hit, I think it was 96% coverage, 96% of Americans with coverage. It was really hard to do that. And we had to keep it under $1 trillion. And we had to pay for the whole thing. So I and our team, we had to come up with $1 trillion worth of savings from other parts of the healthcare system, not from other things, that the government spends money on. That might have been an easier task. No, it had to come from within the healthcare system. So the realpolitik of this was, from the very beginning, we thought we would have liked the subsidies to be a little more generous. They weren't. There was also political disagreement about that, not just with Republicans who were working with us at the time, but also among Democrats. I remember talking to then Governor Joe Manchin, who said to me, I don't know, 400% of poverty, that's really, in my state, that's a really middle class person. I don't know about that. And then the next meeting I had was with Chuck Schumer, who said, oh, that's not nearly enough in New York. You can't make it. So these are you take the facts and then you have to fit
And
them
then there
into
are
the
policy
different.
trade-offs, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Lanhee, I want to ask you, because you were on the other side of this when this debate was happening. Nancy Ann has talked about the number of people they were trying to cover, what it would cost. How do you go and actually verify these numbers? For each of you, did it on each side. Who do you go and trust to actually provide you with reasonable estimates, with enrollment figures, with projections, and with actual data?
Well, this is part of the problem, is that we've entered an environment now where different sides of the debate will want their own numbers, because it may be hard to find an authority that is trusted and agreed upon. Now, I will say, for example, there are entities like the Congressional Budget Office, whose job it is to create a score, as they call it in Washington, but basically an estimate that tells us, for example, what the effect will be on the number of insured, what the effect will be on overall GDP, what the effect will be on the federal budget. And over the years, there have been, tweaks and disagreements on the margins, but by and large, the CBO Current director Phil Swagel is a friend of mine, really good guy who I've known for many years. But they've had a series of directors who I think are trusted economists, and they've got a great career staff that work very hard to produce estimates that are broadly acceptable. The Joint Committee on Taxation has a very specific set of responsibilities in the Congress for finding those same estimates. And then, there's a whole third party environment. There are academics, people at places like Hoover and Stanford who estimate for a living. There are people at think tanks around Washington who do this, and there you're going to get a little bit more debate and dispute because oftentimes there's a question about what the agenda is there. So it's hard. It's very hard. And part of the reason why we're in the environment we're in now is because we've lost in some ways some of that common lexicon around what a trusted authority is. People will automatically dismiss authorities that may have been trusted because the leader was at one point appointed by a Democrat or maybe confirmed by a Senate that was majority Democrat, and therefore they're somehow tainted. It is unfortunate in my mind that that's where we're at. It would be easier, of course, if there were authorities that we could all say, look, we can quibble with a methodological issue here or there, but fundamentally we believe that they're not cooking the books, as it were. And I think the Congressional Budget Office is a great example of an organization that, generally speaking, both sides have respected over the years as an arbiter of a good econometric research that produces the kinds of estimates that we would want to use in policymaking.
I agree.
Nancy, and can I ask about this? So CBO, the head of it, is not appointed each time by a new president, correct?
Yes, I think
No.
it's the Speaker of the House, isn't it?
Yeah.
In
Yeah. In
conjunction with
concert.
the Senate leaders. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It's really a appointment that has to have bipartisan support. That's the
Hmm.
only way to do it because it's an appointment that has to be agreed upon, and the current director had to go through that, and every director has to go through that. And there have been some widely respected, not just Phil, but Doug Holteken, our colleague who Nancy Ann knows well as
Yes,
well. He was someone who had to go through that process, and there have been others over the years as well. So I do think that they try to put in place a process for these positions that requires the buy-in of both sides of the political spectrum intentionally, because you want to create a constituency that is not just rooted in one party or even one part of government or one chamber or another. It's as broad of a constituency as possible.
Can I ask for actual data, enrollment data? Nancy Ann, you ran CMS. I mean, it's CMS. What are the other main organizations that you're going to turn to say, how much did we spend? How many people signed up? Anything along those lines?
well, back in the day when I was at CMS, our Medicaid data wasn't very good. It's much of CMS's data is very lagged. I think the marketplace data is better, maybe in part because we have California and other states reporting in, but we used to use the Urban Institute. They had a model there, the TRIM model, I think was the name of it, that was, and they dealt directly with states and got their most recent data, and it seemed to be more up to date and less lagged than what CMS had. But that's certainly one place I would look. Kaiser Family Foundation uh, also tends to have very good data, especially on Medicaid and the uninsured. Um, uh, what else, Lonnie? Those are two places I think of.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all sources that that have had credibility over the years. I mean, I think states have gotten better at reporting
Mhm.
data as they've developed more sophisticated systems. And when you think about questions around, for example, how many people are enrolled in a state exchange, usually the state exchange is going to produce the best information in terms of what's actually going on. And I've actually found that states, as far as I can tell, are being pretty sincere about wanting to produce data that is accurate, because ultimately their reputations are on the line too. If they end up producing data that's not accurate, then they're going to be called out for it. So I do think that having, again, a common understanding of where the data is coming from and what it's telling us is helpful. Now, there will be questions, of course. For example, one of the issues at play in the debate over the extension of the enhanced tax credits was how much fraud was going on. Was there fraud?
Mhm.
What was the level of fraud? And there, the discussions got a little bit more partisan because people said, look, we don't trust the numbers we're seeing from the state of California, for example. And whether you agree with that or not, that is going to be an issue when you're debating the more political elements of policy. But fundamentally, I don't, my sense is that most people in the center left and center right would agree we don't want fraud to be occurring to the extent it is, and we want to do what we can to prevent that from happening. So there are situations where we'll want to look at multiple sources of data to make a determination about what's actually going on.
That was the E.P.T.Cs. It doesn't seem right now like Congress is going to do anything about those or re-extend them at the moment. That's probably a discussion for the future. I'd like to ask both of you, maybe Nancy Ann, I'll start with you. The 2026 health policy landscape. If we're operating from, we've set the bar. Here's where the ACA stands. Here's where Medicaid, after the One Big Beautiful Bill (OBBB), stands. If you're going to be spending federal dollars on healthcare coverage, how would you structure them? How would you like to see Congress react this year, especially as midterms are coming up?
Well, this year, given the tight margins in Congress and the lack of a real vehicle, unless you think, I guess next year's budget is a possible vehicle, but I
You
think
don't
that's
think a
likely.
reconciliation's another one is likely here for
Well,
healthcare?
they could do that. I think, though, uh, I think there are enough members on the Republican side, from what I hear, who also don't think this is the right thing to focus on. They think they've done their big thing on healthcare. Let's let the system absorb that. They got some of the PBM reforms done in this so-called mini bus that they did last week. Um, so I'm not sure there's so much traction to do another big healthcare bill. There's certainly things to work on. They're having hearings, pretty much every week. There's some new hearing about Medicare Advantage or 340B or whatever the issue is. But I don't honestly see much traction towards another bill. Now, I did hear over the weekend that President Trump's, I think he's calling it the Great Healthcare Plan, um, which was humbling because, in contrast to 10 years of work on a however many page bill, this is a one pager. So, from a communication standpoint, I, I tip my hat. But I've heard that there's some interest in passing that, at least in the House, so they can show some momentum for that. Um,
Okay,
could
but
that
may I ask
create a,
you, yeah, may I ask you on this, less what you think might happen with Congress, other
what I
parts
think should
of health,
happen?
what do you think should happen? What parts of, I mean, when we talk about healthcare, it's many different parts. It is
Hmm.
Medicare, Medicaid, parts within Medicare. It's the Affordable Care Act. It's the employer-sponsored insurance, group plans. Are there areas you think we should put some work into? And I want to know how much, not that you have the same idea of what to do about it, but same areas that maybe Lanhee would also agree up.
Well, and this is an area that I think the president is trying to address in part through his Trump RX, affordability. That is an issue. It is, as I said, when we were working on the Affordable Care Act, we knew that it was going to be difficult, even with all the carrots and sticks that we put in there, to get people to sign up. It turns out California actually led the way here again. They did a California um, uh, premium subsidy. They passed it before the American Recovery Act added the enhanced premium tax credits. It ended up getting subsumed by the federal law, but that showed what it could do to stabilize and strengthen and bring more people into the market. So then the issue is, uh, do you want to figure out a way to continue that? And so probably the answer is the same thing that's happened a couple other times. You were nice enough not to say this, but I worked on the Clinton health reform bill that did not become law. It was much more disruptive in a sense. The Obama law, its ambitions were to work on the part of the market that wasn't working, the uninsured.
Right, it was more
The Clinton law,
subscribed. Yeah.
everyone would have had to change. It was going to take over the employer market. It was very different. But we knew that. I can remember sitting with some House Ways and Means Committee members saying, well, once we pass this, we won't have to do healthcare again. And I said, no, honestly, you will have to, because yes, there are reforms here that have slowed the growth in healthcare costs and Medicare. And we did everything people came up with other than the tax exclusion and medical malpractice reform. We did almost every other idea that people brought to us. You're going to have to keep going back to this. This is a big part of the economy. It's, it's going to keep changing. So we're going to have to keep coming back to it. It's time to look at affordability again. We had reforms that worked for a while. Some of them maybe aren't working anymore. Maybe we need to re-up. There's some ideas on the table, both from the right and the left. So we need probably another group of strange bedfellows to start working together on some of these ideas that they could meet in the middle on. And I think there are some.
Lanhee, what do you see as
Yeah.
the similar or different approaches? I mean, can you kind of sketch out what are the approaches to affordability to healthcare reform
Yeah.
on the right versus and maybe
Well,
where they actually might agree?
look, I think that there are, and I recently wrote a piece about this in an academic journal where I posit that one of the challenges we have in healthcare policy is that people on the polar extremes of both the right and the left desire a set of changes, which I'm sure, while well intentioned from their perspectives, are never going to happen. The
Right.
likelihood that we're going to have a single payer government run system in the US is very, very low. The likelihood we're going to take the current system, blow it up, and go to some kind of market based nirvana is very low. And so, what we're left with, I think, is how do we take the system we have, warts and all, which most Americans actually rather like? How do we take this
There is
system?
that.
Yeah, I mean, how do we take this system and make it better? How do we enhance affordability? How do we put the consumer in charge of more of these decisions? How does the government play a responsible role in ensuring that people have access to affordable coverage, but also that it's fiscally sustainable? And I think if you start with those broad guardrails, there are a couple of areas where I think you'll get agreement between conservatives and progressives. For example, the need for us to have a better sense of how much things actually cost
Yes.
and what the quality of care provided is. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've talked to people. They want to get information about the quality of care. They go to Yelp. Now, Yelp is great for picking restaurants, not so good for picking, who might do your brain surgery. And so we need to have, for example, a better understanding of what the quality of care is that's being provided, what the costs of that care are in different modalities. And then we can couple that with innovative insurance arrangements. We're seeing more and more of this from employers, for example, who are trying to put consumers and patients in charge of more of their health benefit spending. There are limits to that, of course, but by and large, it's very difficult to create a system where there's any kind of awareness of a marketplace if you don't have data around basic cost and quality. And right now we just don't have that in our healthcare system. We've got some measures that have been around that are good, and we should do more to expand upon those, but they're insufficient fundamentally.
Yeah,
So
that's been very disappointing, honestly. I
yeah,
agree with I
and
agree with you. We haven't gotten as far as we should have on that.
and
But there have
there
been
is a
many
role for
efforts to
government.
do it.
There, there,
Yeah.
there is a role. I'll just say there's a role for
Hmm.
government to play here, right? Because government is the one entity that can the federal government can step in and say, here are the kinds of metrics that would be helpful for consumers to understand better and begin to move us in the direction. You can say nudge us or say force us, whatever it might be, but move us in a direction where we have a better sense for what the transparency of that cost and quality might look like.
Nancy, and I want to ask you,
I
not to
agree,
drive a
by the
wedge.
way. So there's
You
one
do
area
agree?
already. Yeah.
I like that. I like that. But now let's talk about where you guys might disagree. If I can try and find a couple areas, one might be who is going to pay for this and decide how these how markets might change, how the government. If we're talking about the ACA right here, and that's kind of just giving money, premium subsidies to people, along with some rules on what insurers are allowed to offer. But if you get into Medicaid insurance for low income Americans, if you get into Medicare, there are a lot of rules that the government sets on what they'll pay for goods, and then also what recipients are expected to pay for. So I'd love to just turn it over to you. Looking at this system, do you think we've got a good mix right now of what the government pays for or what patients are expected to pay for?
That's a hard question, Tom. I think y- yes, but I guess I'd step back another couple of steps to say, One thing that surprised me in the last year or so in talking to um, Republicans in Congress, I won't say conservatives because I don't really know where they fall on the spectrum, but there are Republicans in Congress, and it seems like there is. Uh, if you go back 15 years ago when I was working on the Affordable Care Act, I walked into a situation. Lanhee had been up on the Hill at this point, I think, and there was, in general, an agreement that it was a problem that we had 50 million Americans uninsured, that the number was growing, that employers were dropping, that that people with pre-existing conditions could be excluded, that insurers could run them off through rescissions. Women could be charged 27 times men. There were a set of things that people agreed were a problem that they thought uh, would be worth working on. They obviously didn't agree that the Affordable Care Act was the solution, but at least we agreed on the problem. Now I hear people saying things like, well, I was in a meeting with a group of people and a senator, Republican senator, who pointed to his staffer and said, you know, Tom over there is 25. He doesn't need insurance. We're just paying a lot of money for him. There's no reason to really require him to have it or for anyone to pay for it. You know, I suppose where that would lead you is to some sort of availability of more different types of plans, like a catastrophic plan, which is one thing that has been posited as a solution for, you know, allowing more choice. I just think on both the Republican side and the Democratic side, sometimes um, choice is held up as the answer to things when it really, I'm not sure it is. Like on the Democratic side, having more and more choice of providers and more choice of plans doesn't always, sometimes it makes things very complex and sometimes it allows for more gaming. And on the Republican side, the idea that, well, you can say we should have different types of insurance products, we should have catastrophic plans, but you also have to accept that will make, if you have other marketplaces, that will make their costs go up because you will draw out some of the younger, healthier population into these catastrophic plans. So there's just so many trade-offs in it. Uh, I think it depends partly on how you define the problem.
I think trade-offs is one of the themes of why we're doing this podcast,
It
because
is.
we're starting from same base hopefully, and then different preferences. Lanhee, same quick question for you. Do you think we have a good payer mix right now, from the government, from patients, from private payers, or how much
Well,
needs to change?
one of the things that we have to grapple with is that we have a changing America from a demographic perspective, and increasingly more and more Americans are going to be relying on Medicare, which is the program for older Americans, as the baby boomers retire and as they begin to need more health care. That's just natural. As we get older, we need more health care. There will be a natural pressure from a fiscal perspective that's placed on that program. It's going to be increasingly important. So we do have to think about ways, in my mind, of migrating that program toward a system that compensates more for keeping people well as opposed to the volume of services provided. And I think that's a fundamental rearrangement that, to the credit of the Affordable Care Act, I think the ACA started some of that discussion. We've got to take it to the next level in the next couple of years. But what that also means is that in the broader marketplace, when you talk about Americans who are working age and those who are entering the working environment now, their expectations about the kind of care they're going to get and the kind of plans they have access to are different than the expectations that Nancy Ann or that I might have about what we want from a coverage perspective. And I think that a system that allows for a broad variety of coverage arrangements, where individuals have more choice and can make decisions that they believe syncs up well with their life condition, I think that's an important thing. Now, there's going to be a balance because, to Nancy Ann's point, we can't have a bunch of people running around making choices that make healthcare dramatically more expensive necessarily for other people, right? We have to think a little bit about what that balance looks like. So how do you retain choice and make sure we are maximizing that choice for parts of the population that want to get access to healthcare but don't necessarily want to pay a lot or don't want to have coverage that's super
Hmm.
extensive, We need to allow for that while also recognizing that there are community impacts of the choices those folks make. So that's going to be the delicate compromise over these next couple of years. How do we reach a system that truly expands choice and optionality for more Americans, while also recognizes that the cost of care is deeply tied to the choices that other people make?
That's exactly right. And you and I have talked about this, you know, back after the Affordable Care Act passed, one of the decisions that the president had to make early on was, what do we do about all these plans that are out there that where people are paying, you know, $150 a month for $50 of coverage. And, some call them junk plans, but they're not great. We decided to, the policy term, grandfather them, to allow them to stay even though they didn't meet the standards. Some of them are still around today. There are still people enrolled in those. I saw on something I read recently, some progressives were arguing maybe it's time to finally get rid of those because they do, to some degree, affect, some of the marketplaces. They siphon off people into them. On the other hand, as the way I looked at it was, well, this isn't the coverage that I want for my family. It's not what I aspire to. I hope most people can get better, but it's okay with me if this is what they're choosing, if they have another choice, and if the employer wants to offer that and they have that alongside going in the marketplaces, I'm okay with it. So it's a balance, as Lonnie said, it's a pragmatic decision making, uh, that is hard to do.
Well, let's close just with this. What's one thing you'd want listeners, viewers to take away from this conversation about the future of healthcare reform?
Well, I'll start. I do not think it's going to be possible for either ideological pole to solve this problem on their own. Healthcare is 20% of our economy, roughly speaking, from a consumption perspective. Uh, Everybody's going to need it at some point. It is a part of our economy where the government, federal, state, all the way down to the local, are deeply engaged along with the private sector. Whatever solution we come up with is probably going to make both sides a little upset. And that probably means we've done a good job, because the reality is that you're not going to be able to solve the challenges our system faces by the ideologically purist approach one way or another. So, agreeing on a basic set of facts and understandings about where the system is headed, developing a set of policy solutions that ultimately incorporates elements of both of these approaches, and starting with the low-hanging fruit where we can agree, whether it's around pricing transparency or around
Mhm.
some of these other areas where there is agreement. That's going to be the way to go, and that's the only way we're going to solve and resolve some of the issues that the system faces, as we go into what will be a dramatic period of expansion in terms of the utilization of healthcare services over these next several years and decades.
Couldn't agree more. And I would just add, I think this is implicit in what Lonnie said, but defining the problem. So, what can we even define the problems? I think on transparency, we agree that is a problem. I cannot believe there was a major, you know, change in the Affordable Care Act announced, uh, to require hospitals and plans to make this information transparent. And it's been 15, 16 years and it still hasn't really happened. I give the Trump administration credit for moving it forward some, but my goodness, um, people using Yelp is not the answer here. So that is a problem. So let's agree on a set of problems like that and try to address them. And I think there's hope. I guess that would be my final word on it. There's hope.
Thank you, Nancy and Lanhee. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for doing
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This has been Factual Foundations of Policy, a Hoover Institution podcast from the Tenenbaum Program for Fact-Based Policy. If you have questions you wish we'd covered, please send them in and we'll get to them in a future episode. Also, make sure to check our show notes where we'll post links and sources to everything discussed today. Thank you for watching. We'll talk to you next time.